defining episode of the Greyhorn Pagans Podcast. Pour yourself a cup of tea, light the incense, sit back, and enjoy.
Testing. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Do I look okay?
Always worried about how they look.
Well, I just want to make sure that my camera's straight. You know what I mean? Like, not tilted to one side or the other.
That's why I don't use my camera, because I break it.
Even though
Oh,
she
well.
just done her makeup.
No, I just did my brows. I
don't even wear makeup.
I only do when I need to go somewhere.
Okay, and if I want to show my book, you can see it. Oh, see there, my camera fell over. This is why. Make sure it's working. All right. Well, I'm gonna try.
This is a great start to the show already. It's really setting the mood.
Well,
Chaos and disorder.
is it stable? Okay. All right. And then you can
It
see.
should be stable.
Thing.
Yes. Yeah,
There we
we
go.
can see
All right. Okay.
the book. Awesome. Well,
All
then
right.
I guess it is official. Welcome all to round 2 of tonight of the Greyhorn Pagans Podcast. This time, this show will be with Druid Foxx, and like actual Fox, not Fox, the way I spell it. And of course, I have with me my beautiful co-host, Fire Faye. So yeah, Marjorie, Druid, thank you for coming on. For those who don't know you yet or don't know about you yet, introduce yourself.
Thank you for having me. So my name is Marjorie Foxx. Marjorie is my middle name, so I use that for my pen name, if you will. And Fox is my druid name. I really like foxes, and so I thought that would be a great name to have. You know, it sounds kind of nice together, so I chose that name. And I've been interested in druidry for many years now, since about 2009, 2010. And I recently wrote a book talking about all of the things that I've learned about druidry since I began this journey, which you can purchase on Amazon. It's available. I have it right here. So it's just a quick little introductory guide of common questions that I had about druidry when I was first looking into it. You know, what is a druid? Who were the historical druids? What do they believe? Do they do human sacrifice? You know, because that's in all the movies. You know, can they turn into animals? That's in the video games. You know, just questions like that people might have that they maybe would want an answer, but maybe might be too embarrassed to actually ask someone.
Or
so
perhaps too scared even, especially, you know, if they do human sacrifices, you know, maybe the wrong questions will get you sacrificed somehow.
So I thought, you know, and I had a blog that I have on WordPress. I call it the Druid's Den, and I write book reviews. I read a lot of pagan and druid related books, and I write reviews of them. You know, I'm a librarian by education and profession, and so one of the things that I like to do is this a book that might be worth reading? You know, I try not to judge it on politics so much as like, is it easy to read? Is the content reliable? Do they have sources? Does it stay on topic, or does it wander off into things that aren't necessarily related? And so I do that, and then I answer the questions on my blog. And I thought, you know, people really seem to like the question and answer series. And wouldn't it be great if we could kind of take all of those questions and stick them together into one convenient reference item that somebody would be able to have on hand or share with a friend, or just have them all in one place. So that's what I did. And yeah, and I got invited to be here today to kind of talk about my druidry and my book. And so I thought, yeah, I'll give that a try. And here I am.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's a true pleasure. So I guess first things first, how did you get into druidry? Because it's not, you know, not something you hear about or you read about every day. I mean, most especially for the women, most, and it's, honey, nothing towards you, but most tend to lean more towards the witch or Wiccan side of things.
Not true, and you know how I am. That's not true.
Yeah, I mean, you're a bit of a mixed bag in more than one way.
I'm an old-time witch.
Yeah, so you're still a witch, you know, still more inclined towards witchcraft. But what made you interested in druidry? What made you think like, I might actually be a druid?
So I suppose a little bit of background. I have a lot of Celtic and Norwegian, sort of Northern European ancestry in my family. My great grandparents, I've got people from Sweden and Finland, a lot of Irish ancestors. My great grandfather was Irish. And so I've always been very interested in sort of the family history of things as well. And I had the chance in about 2007, 2008 to do a study abroad. We went to Scotland. And so I was in Scotland for a semester. And we also they took us on little trips every weekend. It was a 3-day weekend. And we go on little trips, to London, or we went to Ireland or Amsterdam, those kind of places. And it was very nice to get to see some of that history and to experience some of those places firsthand that my relatives, had told stories about that I hadn't actually been to myself. And so I thought, well, let's look into that. And so I was very into, the history and the culture of the places. I was an English major, so I did a lot of the poetry and the writing and looking into the literature of these places. And it was very interesting when I was doing my study abroad. We went to a lot of religious sites, and most of those, they didn't really talk about the pagan aspects, really. It was a lot of old cathedrals and churches and, but there was also a lot of like fairy hills and fairy stories. You'd go to these places and they'd have the rowan tree and they'd tell you the story about the fairies. If you moved the rowan tree, the fairies would come and give you bad luck. And so it was kind of this weird integration of a lot of Christian history and Christian saints, but also a lot of fairies and the fae and kind of the magic and the folk traditions that they had there. And, which I thought was very interesting. And when I got done, I kept reading a lot of the Celtic history. And if you read enough Celtic history, eventually you're going to come across the Druids. I mean, they're kind of a big part of that, So I didn't really get that so much in my study abroad, but when I got back home and I kept reading and researching, I kind of discovered them, and I was like reading about them, and I'm like, oh, well, they're these ancient people, they don't exist anymore. Well, it turns out in a roundabout kind of a way. If you read up on books on Druidry, eventually you come across ones that talk about modern Druidry and the revival era Druidry and what really kind of happened to them. And when I found out, oh, there are people today who practice Druidry, it's not just a completely dead religion. It's kind of been revived as sort of a path. And I just started reading more about that. And I remember there was this tarot deck. I saw it at a Barnes and Noble. This was when I was living in Alaska at the time, when I was in the military. And it was this beautiful, gorgeous tarot deck. I think it was called the Shadowscape Tarot. It had a lot of these pictures of fairies and ethereal beings and a lot of foxes. Of course, I had to get it. So then I started collecting tarot decks. And if you read enough of the books that go along with tarot decks, you start to pick up, they start to mention these spiritual things, and maybe it's a new age thing, but they start talking about the divine and they start mentioning other things. And you collect Celtic tarot decks, and there's a few Celtic tarot decks that are put together by Druids. And so you start seeing these things coming together. And then if you hang out in the tarot deck section of the Barnes and Noble, well, what else is in that section is a lot of the pagan books and the New Age books. And then you come across a Druid book about modern Druids. And I said, oh, this isn't in the history section. This is in the religion section. So let's read this and see what that is. And I think the first book I read about modern Druidry that wasn't historical was a book by Penny Billington. And if you know, there's a sect of Druids, a British order, the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, and they're kind of based out of Great Britain, one of the older revival kind of Druid orders. And so she wrote this introductory book on modern Druidry, and here's some of the things that tradition believes and integrates some of the history. And so I read that book and I thought, oh, this is really kind of nice, and I felt really drawn to it. And especially living in Alaska and Anchorage, nature's everywhere there, like the parks, the trees. I mean, the moose and the wolves and the bears walk down Main Street. You can't get to your car in the morning because there's a moose standing right there. And it's very integrated with the everyday life, more so than any other large city I've ever lived in,
Yeah, those are some interesting problems to have.
Oh yeah, I knew a guy, he was on his way to work one day and he was stopped at a stoplight, not moving at all, and some moose came out of nowhere and totaled his truck, just ran right into it and gouged it up, and the poor guy called into work and he said, I can't come in today. I've just been attacked by a moose. I mean, that's the kind of thing that happens. So, nature is very present in a way that it hasn't been when I lived in, St. Paul, Minneapolis, or when I lived in San Antonio. It's very present there. And so it made sense to kind of build relationship with nature while I was there. And then when I left and I came home, and I continued to be interested in it. And I just started reading more and more about it, and I found there's a lot of different kinds of Druidry. It's not just one particular kind. There's so much, and there's so many different kinds. And what you find out very quickly is that there's dozens and dozens of different Druid orders, and they all believe similar yet different things. One of the things that is a very famous saying among Druids is if you ask 2 Druids the same question, you'll get 5 answers. The more I read about it, the more I realize, that's actually very, very true.
So how does that work? That's 2 Druids, 5 answers. Okay. Yeah.
Druidry is very complex. So if you look at the ancient Druids, the Celtic Druids, the ancient pre-Christian Druids, they were kind of considered the priestly caste, the educated caste of their society. And they did things like they would advise the king on matters of history, war, music. And so when you look at it, you think, oh, Druids were priests. Well, they weren't just priests. It was kind of like if you look at a doctor today, a PhD, somebody who has a PhD. They could be a doctor of theology, they could be a medical doctor, they could be a doctor of music, or they could have a doctorate and have several different minors, a doctor who minored in history, for example. And so they do all these different things, but they're a doctor. And so if you look at the ancient Druids, that's kind of what they're like, and back in the day when a lot of people weren't really educated how we would think of education, not everybody knew how to read and write. Not everybody, they didn't have formal schooling necessarily for the average person like we do today. And so a Druid was somebody who was the PhD holder of their era. They had been to many, many years of study and education. There are sources, the Celtic, when the Romans came, there were sources where Julius Caesar and some of these Romans were writing about their experience with the Celts, and they were saying, yeah, the Druids, it takes them 20 years to study to become a Druid. And that sounds like a lot, but then if you think about it, well, if you start, say, in kindergarten when you're 5 years old, and then you go through 12 years of school, and then you go to college, and you've got 4 to 6 to 8 years after that, well, that's about 20 years to get a PhD. Yeah. And back then, there wasn't really quite as much of a separation between religion and these other tasks, So a Druid might be a historian. They might memorize the history of their tribe and the major battles and the history of their kings, who'd be able to recite it at court to the king when the king's asking for advice. But they also integrate those religious aspects, the stories of their gods and the stories of their ancestors, because to them, these weren't necessarily these distant beings, but people that, you look back on it and you see that they considered some of these gods and heroes and things to be their ancestors. And so those stories weren't just, made up mythology to them. They were real stories. Not necessarily literally true, but they had a true meaning behind them, and so, or a Druid might have focused their study on medicine and healing, and they might be a healer for their tribe, but they also healed on the spiritual level. It wasn't just about the physical body, but about the spiritual well-being of the tribe as well. And so a lot of these things were integrated back then among all the Celts, because the Celts were many, many different tribes. It wasn't all just one big Celtic tribe. It was many different smaller tribes that shared a common language. But each tribe had its own local deities and heroes and traditions. And so the Druids had a kind of a central college where they taught how to be a Druid, but then the Druids would go back to their individual tribes. And so the ancient Druids, they're not necessarily all worshiping the same gods or following the same traditions or religion necessarily, but they're kind of doing these things under the philosophy of Druidry, and they're fulfilling a particular role in their tribe where they're doing these things. So like one tribe might be worshiping, Bridget, and another tribe might be worshiping Lou. They're not sharing the same God, but they're kind of sharing the same philosophy around it. Like, this is how you honor a deity, no matter which deity it happens to be, kind of a thing. And, so the Romans came and they kind of wanted to put the stomp on the Druids, because the Druids were highly educated. And if you're planning to conquer, a land, it makes sense that you would want to get rid of the smart people first to make the other people a little bit more easy to control.
Yeah.
And
of course.
And this was before the Romans were Christian too. So this was all pre-Christian, this conflict. And so the Romans came and they put the stomp on the Druids. They said, we want to be in charge here. It's easier to be in charge when you get rid of the people who can think up plans to stop you. And so Druidry kind of went a little bit underground there. It wasn't considered very popular. And a lot of the Romans, they would make stuff up about the Druids. Oh, the Druids did human sacrifice. That's scary. Regardless of whether or not the Romans were doing that themselves, didn't matter. It was just you're trying to make them sound scary.
Yeah, of
So
course.
you got to take some of those sources with a little bit of a grain of salt, I think, because,
I
we
mean,
can't go back in time and ask them. And a lot of the Druids, they didn't write things down.
No, it was an
because
oral tradition, right?
It was. And it's not that the Druids didn't know how to write, because they did write. They wrote in with the Greek alphabet, actually, and they did have a different alphabet of their own that they wrote on, standing stones and tombstones, and
Mhm.
they did write. They just didn't write down their religious information because they felt that it was sacred, and that if you wrote it down, well, you wouldn't be bothered to remember it, would you, if you could just write it down? Which is,
True.
it's the same complaint that the Greeks had about people. Oh, they're writing things down in books, and the Victorian, oh, you're reading too many novels, you're not going to remember anything anymore. Oldest complaint in the world.
Yeah, and nowadays we would say that to kids who have a vivid imagination, like, oh, you're reading too many books, or you're watching
Right,
too much TV, or
you're watching too much oh, you're just looking it up on Google, you're not bothering to remember it.
This sounds like Native American stuff too, because they never wrote down their religious practices either, and they did oral stuff like storytellers.
Yeah, and so the ancient Druids and Celts believed that there was power in the human mind, and that you had to train the human mind to remember things, because they didn't have the internet or the Google, and if they needed to know something, they needed to be able to remember it out of their own head. They couldn't just look it up. And so they
yeah,
were very concerned with training their minds to remember things, and training themselves how to think through problems by same principle why we memorize the times tables when we're children.
hmm
It's not that you can't do it on a calculator, you can, but if you memorize it, then you'll always know it, even if you don't have a calculator handy.
yeah,
Might not make sense for modern people. I mean, you carry around a smartphone, you've got time, but So
yeah.
they
No,
didn't write a lot of things down, and
mhm.
so that makes it hard to figure out, well, is this propaganda true or not? Because we don't have a primary source from the Druids necessarily, because they themselves weren't writing. So we're getting a lot of writing from the Romans coming in, and we're getting a lot of writing from the Christians coming in, but we're not necessarily getting writing from a pagan Druid that supports or refutes these things. We have a lot of other evidence, the artwork, the standing stones, cultural artifacts, those kinds of things we have, but not necessarily hey, this is our particular religious belief.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense, and especially since like the well-known phrase "history is written by the victor," of course. So
Yeah.
yeah, it makes sense. All the the ghost stories, and like, oh, they did this and they did that. I mean, Norse Germanic paganism, same thing. It's just Northern European paganism. Whoever
Yeah.
conquered them was always trying to demonize them. I
Yeah.
mean, we
And
like we still do that today. Before I went on with you, I of course had a show with John, former military, and it's always you're always fighting the bad guys, no matter whose side you're on. The other side are always the bad guys, and they did this, and they have committed those atrocities.
yeah.
Whether it's true or not. I mean, I want to bet 9 out of 10 times it ain't true, but
Well, yeah. And if it is true, I mean, there is some archaeological evidence that Celtic tribal people did have formalized executions of some sort. Now, is that because
that's
these people were a religious sacrifice, or were they regular criminals or prisoners of war that would have been executed otherwise? And just because you have a priest present, does that mean it's a religious sacrifice? I mean, we have the death penalty in some states in America, where a criminal
mhm.
who's a horrible murderer, rapist, whatever, might be executed, and there might be a priest present in the room when that happens to administer the last rites. Does that make it a human sacrifice? Now, we have a priest we can ask him today and be like, and he's going to say no, but we don't have that for the ancient Druids. Ask them, was this a religious sacrifice because the Druid was present and this man was ritually executed?
Yeah, I mean,
All we have is the bones to go on. So,
and I want to bet in like 1,000 years, the people who'll be alive then are, going to ask the same questions about us, they'll see the drawings or the writings and the customs and all, and they're going to be like, was this a ritual? Is this something, was this something religious, or was it, just like ordinary? It's something that, history repeats itself. So of course, like, in another 1,000 years, people are going to ask the same questions.
So I always thought that was kind of interesting, but and wider people today call themselves Druids. How did we get from the ancient Celts to modern Druids? So depending on who you ask, the ancient Druids were either completely wiped out by the Romans, or they weren't, because you can look back at the history and the Druids, because they had different specialties. You had people like the bards, and the bardic tradition and the bardic colleges lasted quite a long time, well up into the, I guess you could call it, modern era, the 1500s or so. There were still people going to these bardic colleges and learning the bardic tradition, which could have been a Druidic tradition that survived. And you also had a lot of, too, because the ancient, it wasn't necessarily about the specific god or gods they were worshiping, but more about the method they were using to do that. Is a lot of them did convert to Christianity. In the Celtic tradition, there's a lot of traditions about triple-faced gods and goddesses, gods that appear with three different faces, the mother, the maiden, the crone,
Yeah.
And so when Christianity came along, they said, well, we have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And also another thing that Christianity did, particularly Catholicism, was they would incorporate local entities and make them saints. So you have Bridget, who was a Celtic goddess who became a Christian saint. And so a lot of these converted to Christianity and continued to fulfill their role, but now they were Christian priests. And so the name of it kind of changed, but the role that they were fulfilling in society kind of stuck around a little bit longer. And this was actually quite a big deal for the formal Roman Catholic Church, because the Celtic Christians, they kept some of their traditions. They had a different style of tonsure where the monks would shave their head in a particular way, and they would have their New Year on a particular day, and they would celebrate Christmas on a different day. And it was the Celtic tradition. And so the Catholics were like, oh, we want you to celebrate it the way we do in Rome. And they actually had to go and make rules saying you can't do it that particular way because that's too pagan. We want you to do it the way we do in Rome. You can't shave your head that particular way. You have to do it the Roman way, shave the circle on the top, right? They used to do it around like a big rainbow and shave their forehead. But
Oh, right. I've seen that before. And it seems like the shaving of the head in a particular way, like there's definitely something to it. I just saw a video, I believe either today or maybe yesterday, about the Chinese, and like a specific religious group within the Chinese, who of course like just have the enormous like ponytail or braid like coming from the back of their head, and everything else just shaved. Like, it seems to be really important how you shave your head and what you don't shave.
I mean, a lot of religions and a lot of spiritualities have this tradition, to kind of clear space to let the spiritual energies in or out, or as a sign of devotion to your particular faith. And then the particular design of the shaving, I guess, varies from tradition to tradition, but most of them kind of have a tradition of shaving of some sort, I guess you could say. But so a lot of these ancient Druidic traditions survived a little bit, depending on where you go in the history and who you ask. Some of these things could have continued from the ancient times. Some of them could have been inventions. And so I believe it was the 1700s, there was a great revival and interest in Druidry among the British and Celtic people. They were looking into ways to kind of bolster their patriotism and to celebrate their history. And
so like right around the Renaissance era.
So you're looking at the early 16 and 1700s. Archaeology was still in its infancy, but people suddenly started to get interested in things like Stonehenge and these ruins that were in their backyard, and they had been ignoring, and the farmers had been taking the rocks and building fences with them. And suddenly people started to get interested in, well, but what are these things really? And who built them? And where did they come from? And what do they mean? And so people started to associate, oh, well, Stonehenge, that must have been built by the Druids, because they didn't have carbon dating yet. at the time, so they just thought old rocks, maybe it was the Druids. Turns out they're a lot older than that.
Oh.
Yes, they're from before the Celts arrived in Britain. Was Stonehenge was, the Stone Age, so it was pre-Celtic. Now, depending on who you ask, were the Druids a native religion? Was it the pre-Celtic Britons who had Druidry, and then the Celts came and the Celts adopted Druidry from them, and then it spread out that way? Or was it a purely Celtic thing that came to Britain and then the natives adopted Druidry? Or it could be a mix of both. We don't know. Like I said, they didn't write a lot of things down for us, so it's all speculation. The early archaeologists became very interested in this, and they started researching and coming up with theories about, well, we think the Druids built it, and because it reacts to the sun on these particular days, like the solstices and the equinoxes, it lines up in this way. That means the Druids must have worshipped on these particular days. And there was a very famous Welsh man, and he had a pen name, Iolo was his pen name, and he came up with a lot of ideas and wrote them down and said, oh, the ancient Druids did this, and he started revival Druidry. He started to say, well, we can practice Druidry today, and we should do that now. It turns out he made up a lot of what he wrote, but it was very believable at the time.
Yeah, because people didn't really know any better, and since there are no true scripts or scriptures, everybody could write anything, and it's just, oh, that sounds plausible.
But also too, there's this concept in revival era Druidry that's supposedly drawn from ancient traditions, may or may not be, we don't know for sure, but it's plausible, is there's this concept of the Awen, the divine spirit of inspiration, kind of, and it's sort of similar to like the Holy Spirit in Christianity, or maybe the Om from Buddhism. This kind of spiritual entity that can be interacted with, that can inspire you, that you can kind of connect with the divine through this, called Awen. And so when he was writing all of these revival things, he says, well, the spirit of Awen told me, kind of like how Christians believe, well, the Pope is divinely inspired. Anything the Pope writes must be from God. Well, the spirit of Awen told him this, therefore it must be true. And so it's kind of like that, personal gnosis kind of a thing, where he's feeling inspired by the divine to write these things, that this must be how. I don't know if it's true or not, I have no idea, but it became very, very popular, and a lot of people decided they liked this idea and they were going to adopt his ideas in their Druidic practice and tradition. And the other thing that's very interesting too is a lot of these revival era Druids were also Christian clergy, interestingly enough, because again, like I said, the ancient Druids, it didn't particularly matter which god they were worshiping. It was more the method and the role they were playing, and each tribe had their own local deities. And so if you look at it that way, Druidry becomes more of a philosophical thing than it is a particular religious thing. And so these Christian clergy, who were very interested in their cultural history and in reviving their native patriotism, became interested in Druid, and they said, well, we can do this and still be Christian. It's a philosophy and not necessarily a religion with hard dogma, and we can adapt these traditions and kind of meld them together and do both, if you will. That was very popular for a while. So if you look at that, they say, oh, Druidry is a modern religion. Well, 1600s, that's older than a lot of other more modern religions and Christian sects and things, so it's had a few hundred years to kind of develop and coalesce, at least.
But I mean, 1600s is still,
it's still fairly modern. But I mean, 500 years or so that it's been around.
Closing in on 500 years quick.
So there's quite a lot of tradition, the revival era and the British Druidry, that has been around for a while. But there's also more modern sects that didn't come about until, like, say, the 1950s and 60s, especially in North America. Now, North America Druidry didn't really pick up until around the 1950s and 60s is when you started getting some of these American orders being founded. One of the largest and most famous is the Reformed Druids of North America, and they were founded in Minnesota, where I live, actually, at a college. And this college had a requirement that you had to go to a religious service every week in order to get credit for your college classes. Some of the students said, well, we don't like that you require us to go to a specific religious service. If we're going to go to a religious service, we should be able to go to whichever one we want. It shouldn't have to be a particular religion, because coerced religion isn't really religion. So
Yeah,
we should be
true.
able to do what we want. And so they decided, well, let's call ourselves Druids. They found a book in the library that talked about Druids, and they thought, let's make up our own new order of Druidry. We're going to call ourselves Reformed because we don't believe in human sacrifice. So we're Reformed. We don't do that. And we're going to meet every Sunday out in the woods and have a ritual, and we're going to be Druids. And if the college doesn't give us credit for that, well, then they're violating our rights to freedom of religion. They did that for a while, and eventually the college kind of caved and said, okay, yeah, fine, we'll give you credit for that. And then eventually they dropped the religious service requirement altogether.
I mean,
But
good,
a lot of
good
the
thing too.
students, yeah, and a lot of the students continued to practice this even after the religious requirement stopped, because they started finding meaning in it, and they started looking up the things about the Druids and finding meaning in it, and so they continued to practice it. And what's interesting about that is that it's this particular branch of Druidry, the Reformed Druids, actually branched out a lot of the neo-pagan Druids, because they had kind of a schism where some of the students wanted this form of Druidry to be not just philosophical, but truly pagan. They wanted to only worship the ancient Celtic pagan gods. They wanted the other Druids to deny monotheism and to sign some agreement saying they're polytheist, and they're going to believe in polytheism, and they wanted
But
to make it much more about that. And
but
some of the
that's still dogma. That's still dogmatic. If you have to write
right,
down the rules, even but I
yeah,
guess it's different because this is pagan, or
right. So there was a schism between the Druids who wanted Druidry to remain philosophical and
Mhm.
non-dogmatic and to be open to people no matter which deity they were going to worship, and the people who were like, no, you have to deny monotheism, you have to deny Christianity, it has to be fully pagan, and you have to believe in magic, and you have to do these particular things. And they kind of split off, and that particular guy eventually decided, well, if you're not going to agree to do that, then I'm going to go to California and found my own group. And he eventually founded the ADF, very famous American neo-pagan Druid order, and they're
Mm.
much more polytheistic, and they don't believe in monotheism, and they're a lot more religious than the Reformed Druids. Are very chill. They're like, well, all you really have to do is believe that spiritual meaning can be found in nature, is kind of their thing, and
I
that's
mean,
really all you
that's
really need to participate with them. But these other groups, they wanted more rules and more dogma and more hard, this is how you do it kind of
but
thing.
that goes completely against it. That's not. I mean, as you've been saying, like we can't travel back in time yet, and
Right.
ask them. But like I do imagine, knowing what we know about ancient practices. I mean, yeah, there were set rules, of course, but not about how you should believe, what you should believe. There is no like set practice, like you start with this and then you do this and then you do this, and if you don't,
Yeah.
you're a sinner or a
Yeah.
heretic or like whatever you are.
Yeah.
So with Druidry being so incredibly well nature based, as is like really any, well, let's say non-monotheistic religion, I can imagine it's also being very free flowing, very very much being about about the energy, about the intent, about being close with nature. So if you're gonna set boundaries to that, you're defeating the whole purpose.
Yeah. And and some people really like having that kind of structure in their practice. It helps them to maintain a practice, helps them to develop and to do things that they would get lazy and they wouldn't do them. So some people really enjoy that. But
Yeah.
in my
Okay.
view, you can't really force that on somebody else necessarily. But if they want, but so he said, I'm going to found my own sect, and so he did, and that's fine. That's great. People who wanted to follow that particular sect can do that. And then that sect had a schism too, a little
Of
while
course.
later, because some people said, well, we only want to do just the Celtic deities, and the other ones were like, well, but we think you should be able to do any Indo-European. And then there's also been other schisms where some are like, well, we're going to only, the strict hardcore, I guess you could call it reenactment druids, where like only if there's archaeological evidence of such a thing will we do it.
Oh,
You
those.
know,
Okay. Yeah, those
those
kind of
ones,
people. Yeah.
yeah, the reenactment kind of pagans who are like, if there's archaeological evidence of it, then we're going to do it, and if there's not, then you're not allowed to do it. And they get very into that, so they founded their sect. And so you look at it, and there's about, you know dozens and dozens of different sects of Druidry that all kind of started to branch off one another because certain people were like, well, I want to do this particular thing, so I'm going to found my own sect. And then other people who liked it joined them. But then they said, well, but I want to do this thing a little bit different. And then they founded a sect. And so now you look at it today and you can Google it and there's dozens and dozens of sects, and each one is a little bit different than the one next to it, even though they all kind of come from the same inspiration.
Yeah,
And
no, that really seems to be a trend with like so many of those, we'll call it spiritual communities or occult groups. There's always like splinter groups of branches of, and so on and so forth. I mean, that's, I guess you could say, like, even the Greyhorn Pagans is kind of that, because I joined many groups in my time, tried it with many groups, never really felt like I got the freedom that I wanted. So I just said, fuck y'all, I'm going to do it myself.
Right. And I feel like that's very in keeping with the ancient inspiration, because like I said, each individual tribe had their own traditions and their own holidays and their own deity. So why wouldn't modern Druids, depending on location, why wouldn't each sect have their own traditions and particular ways of doing things and deities? Even though we kind of share the same language, so to speak, we're all walking through the same forest, but we're taking different paths to kind of get there, is how I like to think of it. So I don't see anything wrong with having all these different sects. I think it's important to, if you're interested in it, read about all of the different ones. I mean, that's what I did, is I looked up, all of the major sects. You got the Reformed Druids, the ADF Druids, the couple of two different British orders of Druidry, the Obods. You got the New Order Druids. I think they're Dutch, the New Order, out of the Netherlands, I believe. And there's so many different ones that you can read about and learn from. And so I figured, well, see if they've got any literature, read that, talk to people who are part of it, and see if it's something that you agree with or don't agree with. Maybe Druidry is not for you, or maybe that particular kind of Druidry isn't for you. You have options, and there's not one overarching, there's not a Druid Pope, right? Who's going to tell you this is or is not the way to be a Druid. I mean, each little sect might have their own requirements for joining their group. Like maybe one group says you have to be ordained through us, and another group says, well, you can ordain yourself.
I mean, a Druid Pope would definitely be interesting. I mean, I don't see it working, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
Right. So at the moment, there is no Druid Pope to excommunicate you. If you don't mesh with a particular group, find a different one or make up your own. But, there is some work that needs to be, you do have to read up a little bit about it. You can't just, I'm a Druid one day and you've never read a word about it,
No, that's
you
not...
should at least do the basics, at least read up a little bit on the history, read a few of the books from different founders and groups, and do a little bit of your own research and take it seriously. Have fun.
I mean, that's kind of like those people who watch like 2-3 episodes of Vikings and then, buy a rug from IKEA and start screaming to Valhalla.
Right. I mean, no one's going to tell you can't do that. A lot of people do that, but people are going to look at you a little bit funny, and they're not going to take you seriously if that's how you do it.
No, definitely not.
That would be my advice. People who are interested should do a little bit of research. If you're interested in Celtic history and you love Celtic culture, but you're not necessarily interested in Druidry, that's totally fine. That's the beauty of modern Druidry, as I see it, is that it's flexible. It's there for those who want to participate, but you don't have to. I just think that's beautiful.
And another starting point to learn about Druidry is, of course, your book. So how did that came to be? Why all of a sudden a book? Like, isn't a blog just enough?
Well, so I've written a few other books in the past as well. One of my first jobs I ever had was I used to write for a newspaper, and I had my own little column there, and I wrote a bunch of different things, and I just always thought, wouldn't it be nice to make a book? And so I just collected all my essays together, and there's this wonderful program on Amazon, the KDP, Kindle Direct Publishing. You can self-publish your own book. You don't have to go through a publisher. It's a very professional looking book, and it's just so much easier now than it was 15, 20 years ago trying to write a book. Like, how are you going to publish a book that looks decent, that isn't cheesy, and how are you going to get it on Amazon? There wasn't really an easy way to do that back in the day, but now it's just very easy to do yourself. If you put in the time and effort to do it, you can do it. And so I've always been a writer. I've always written poetry and essays and stories and things, and I've always been doing that as kind of like a hobby. And so I thought, oh, well, why don't I put these together as a book? And so I did that. I did poetry, essays, young adult fantasy novel, and I thought, this is great. I have a book. I started as I was doing my research into Druid. I was reading a lot of books on paganism and different religions. I've always been fascinated by different faiths and spiritualities. And I thought, well, I'm reading an awful lot of these books. Maybe I should write book reviews because I'm reading them anyway.
Yeah.
It's not like it's taking me any extra time. I'm going to read it anyway. I might as well tell people what I thought of it.
Sure.
And as a librarian by profession, readers advisory, people want to know what kind of books are out there. Are they worth reading? What are they about? And so I just decided I'm going to start a blog and I'm going to write book reviews. And one of the classes I actually took when I was doing my master's degree was a web design class where you had to design a website, for the class. And I thought, oh, well, if I have to design a website anyway, I might as well make it one that I'm going to keep using and that it's not just going to be a throwaway for the class. So I designed my website and I decided to keep the website and keep writing on it after I got my degree. And so I started posting my book reviews. And then I thought, oh, I had a lot of these questions about Druidry when I first started. I bet you other people have similar questions. Why don't I post some of those on the blog as blog posts and see what people think of them? So I started doing that and people really seemed to enjoy them. And I thought, if I get enough of those together, maybe I could put them together in a book. I'm already writing them anyway. It's not like it would take me any extra effort to just copy and paste them and format and put them into a book. So I thought, oh, I'm going to try that. So that's what I did. And I think it worked out very well. So I was writing the blog for a few years, writing it and when I finally felt like I had enough content to justify a book is when I decided, I'm going to pull all this, put it together and make a book. And then I wrote a few extra questions and answers too, specifically just for the book that aren't on the blog. So there are 4 or 5 ones that are in the book that aren't on the blog. So if you like the blog, there's more in the book that you can go. Yeah. I thought I'm already reading these books anyway. I already have all of this information and knowledge. I'm already answering these questions for myself. How can I share that with other people? Because one of the things the Druids did was they shared their knowledge with their community. And how can I do that today as a Druid? How can I share my knowledge with the community? And so that's one way that I can do that is by putting it on the blog or by publishing it in a book.
It's funny how all those things came together. Like you need to design a website. Oh, well, okay, I'll just, guess I'll just use the website. Oh, I'm reading a lot of books anyway. Oh, let's write about it. And if I'm writing about the books, why not write my own book? It's interesting how that developed itself.
One of the first books I published was my novel, and it's a funny story. This novel I wrote. Apparently, I wrote it in high school.
Oh, that's
this
gonna
novel
be a
that I
doozy.
wrote. It was called Talisman's Tale. But I wrote it and I saved it on my USB drive. I saved it and then I completely brain dumped it. Forgot all about it. Disappeared from my head for 15 years. Had no idea I'd written a novel. I just totally wrote it one day and then forgot about it. And then I was going through my old, computer and stuff, and I plugged this thing in and I opened this up. I said, this is a couple of 100-page novel.
Wow.
I wrote this, and it was like reading something written by somebody else because I had completely wiped it from my brain. So that's good for editing, having fresh eyes on something, completely forgetting for 15 years.
Going back. After 15 years,
that'll make editing a little bit less emotional because you're not as attached to it.
God, so I hate the editing process. Like I love the whole writing and like promoting it and thinking of clever ways and all, but just the editing and having to make it look nice and deciding, okay, am I gonna keep this in? Is this redundant? Is this too much? Do I need to explain this any further? Oh man. If I had the funds, I would let someone else do it because if I could skip that part, I would. But
So I suppose I'm kind of the opposite. I don't like having to sit down and write it all out the first time, but the editing I'm fine with. But I don't know, maybe the whole wait 15 years and then go back and edit isn't for everybody. That takes some either really good luck or some very long-term planning. I don't think most people can pull off that particular method.
15 years it's quite a while to wait and like hope you'll indeed forget. You'll actively have to try to forget. Like I have to remember that I need to forget it.
Right. So yeah, when I decided to write my Druid book, I thought, yeah, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna pull everything together that I've been writing for a year or two and just kind of re-edit it and reformat. And I did write a few extra things specifically for the book. And I tried to keep my questions and answers. I tried to answer them from a non-denominational perspective, druids and druidry in general. I wasn't trying to push any particular sect or tradition. I was just like, this is what the ancient archaeology and sources show. This is what some modern druids believe. Here are a couple of different examples, how it might work for some people, but I didn't want to push a particular sect or way of doing things.
Yeah, you wanted to keep it pretty neutral and like just all encompassing, as the Druids back then probably did.
Yeah, and I also wanted to avoid dating the information by inserting current events or current world politics into it, because a lot of the books that I review, they're great books until all of a sudden they're inserting current buzzwords and current politics and talking about current, political things. And I'm like, this was a great book until you kind of veered off the tracks and started talking about, current world politics. And here's how you go to a rally for this thing and the other thing. And here's how you, if I'm reading a book on religion, I want to read about religion. I don't want to read about who voted for this American president or things like that. Like that's not something that I think is necessary.
Yeah, no,
in a
but
book
it's
like that.
No, it's something that gets pushed in media a lot already. It's most likely the main reason why a lot of popular media actually is failing, because it is religious in the way that they're preaching to you, but it's all stuff that is like, just you're an actor, just act. You're a writer, just write. We don't care about your politics. We don't care about your beliefs. We don't care who you voted for. Like in 10 years, what's it gonna matter anyway? Your story is great. Set up, awesome. The premise, and then you veer off into politics, and it's just okay.
Right.
Done.
And so and the other thing that I tried to do too in my book is I don't bash any other sects or practices. A lot of the books that I review, they'll pick a particular sect and say, well, this sect is bad because blah, but we're doing it right. I didn't do that. I said, here's what some sects believe. Here's why some of them believe that. Make up your own mind. I didn't set out to call anybody out or to make anyone out to be a bad guy. And a lot of modern pagan books, I've noticed, have a bit of a tendency to do that. They say, well, we don't think people should do that, but it's okay when we do that because these people we really don't like. And it may or may not be a legitimate reason not to like them, but I don't really think that has a place in that kind of book, especially when you're writing something geared towards beginners, geared toward people who are just starting out. They don't need that. When they're just starting out, they're just trying to figure out, is this even something I'm interested in enough to continue? They need information from a broader spectrum, the big picture. They're not ready for the nitty-gritty details of infighting and politics yet. And if they want that later on, then maybe include that in a more advanced book, but don't put it in your book for beginners,
Yeah, no, exactly. It's still a big thing in paganism, like the whole especially like the Christian bashing and all. I keep saying this, but it's just because it's true. A lot of people are pagan just because they are anti-Christ. They don't like the church. They don't like what it has done. They don't like what the church stands for nowadays. So out of spite or out of protest or just like trying to be edgy, they turn to paganism, because the church hates paganism. I hate the church, therefore paganism.
Yeah, and the thing about Druidry too is because a lot of the revival era and a lot of the modern Druidic tradition is Christian, and so it's silly for me to see that in Druidry, because Druidry as a philosophy, from all of the research that I've done, you can be Christian and be a Druid, you can be Buddhist and be a Druid, you can be Jewish and be a Druid. You can be Wiccan or some flavor of Norse or pagan and be a Druid, because the Druidry that I've learned about is more on the philosophical of more the method, not necessarily the who, and so I see that as kind of silly to bash Christianity when Druidry as we know it today might not exist if it wasn't for those Christian clergy coming together and reviving that interest in the ancient Druids. And if it wasn't for those Druids who converted to Christianity in those monasteries writing down these Celtic traditions and these local histories and things, Druidry as we know it today wouldn't exist today without Christianity. And it does a great disservice to dismiss that and to make fun of it and to belittle it simply because you personally don't wish to believe that particular religion or in that particular god.
Same thing goes for the Norse. Same thing goes for the Germanics. Like, we all praise the works of Snorri Sturluson, especially for Norse paganism, but he was a Christian. He was a Christian minister, but he is the one that wrote down our stories. So really, if it wasn't for him, we'd still be in the dark, or know a lot less than we know now. With the Germanics, Tacitus, for example, Roman general, the Germanics and the Romans, they don't really go together well. But he wrote down so many things, especially with the whole, Teutoburg and all. So if it wasn't for that one particular Roman general, then, the Germanic people and the Germanic tribes, like, their knowledge would most likely be lost to time. So, I mean, and that's kind of the pitfall of oral traditions. Like, as soon as oral traditions get outlawed, or the people who, pass down those traditions, made short work of, then, it gets lost. So we kind of depend on who we see as the enemy or the bad guy, or, the other party. If they write it down, then at least we have something. It may be written down by the people who, mowed us down, but, without them, we wouldn't have anything.
Right. And, and it's interesting. People always want to make one side out to be the total bad guy. Every bad thing that happened in that conflict was on one side. And that's not true. History is a lot more complicated than that. There were bad things on both sides that happened.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're going to say, Christianity's evil and force people to convert, okay, well, the Celts were chopping people's heads off, and it was the ancient world. There was a lot of head chopping on both sides. It's silly to condemn one side for it.
And like infighting between the tribes. Like, it wasn't a unified Britain, it wasn't a unified France, it wasn't a unified Germany. Or like what we now know as those countries. At least they were different tribes, and they had their issues with other tribes as well. As you said, they may have believed in the same gods, but the worship was a little different. But same goes nowadays. It's just on a much larger scale, or like not even. There's if we're talking about Europe, take football or soccer, I guess, for all you Americans. That's rivalry between two cities usually. Here in the Netherlands, it's a lot of Amsterdam versus Rotterdam. There's still two Dutch cities. It doesn't mean that
ritualized warfare. We've ritualized the warfare into an event, just like the ancient Aztecs did with their ball game, where you've turned it into we're going to have these warriors represent our side and those represent yours, and they're going to fight it out in a non-deadly way to get it out of our system so that we don't have to actually kill each other. Now,
exactly.
if only other conflicts could be solved that way, I think that would be great. But people being people, that's not going to happen all of the time.
No, I feel that the people who are sending us to war, like, we should just send them, the people high up in their ivory towers, just like, you guys go do that. No, how about you? No.
And, for all of paganism, they like to glorify my ancestors were warriors and they did this and that. And then it's like, okay, well, if the Christians want to honor their warrior ancestors, suddenly it's bad.
And
I don't know, but
what are the odds that all of our ancestors were warriors? Like, then who grew the food? Who fattened up the pigs? Who took care of the cattle? like the warriors weren't doing that. Yeah.
Right, and so I think it's let people be proud of their ancestors, whoever they may be. Don't belittle your ancestors, because without them you wouldn't be here. You don't have to agree with everything they did, but you should at least be thankful that what they did allowed you to be, in my opinion. And a lot of modern druids kind of integrate that honoring of the ancestors into their traditions. And in Druidry, there's this concept of the 3 different kinds of ancestors. There's your ancestors of blood, your physical family, your mom, your dad, your grandparents, going back. The ancestors of tradition, your fellow druids, the people who established the traditions that you're now following, regardless of whether or not you're blood related to them. And then there's the ancestors of your place. Where do you live? Who lived there before you? Who cultivated the land? Who built the buildings? Who made it so that you could live there? It's important to honor all 3 of these branches of your ancestry and not just exclude one or the other because, oh, well, my blood ancestor did a bad thing, therefore I'm going to ignore. No, because you need them to be there for you to be there physically. You can't just ignore your ancestors of place because they did something bad, because if they didn't cultivate that place, you wouldn't have any place to be at. And you can't ignore the ancestors of your tradition because you don't like how the founder founded his tradition because he made some stuff up. But if he didn't make it up, there wouldn't be the tradition for you to complain about. So
yeah, I mean, it's a lovely paradox, and like I guess it's an overused excuse at this point, but a lot of what our ancestors did or didn't do is also a product of the times. We like to project our modern way of thinking for as far as it's modern, because that's also a product of our time, of course, but we like to project it into the past. So if something doesn't fly and our ancestors or your ancestors or their ancestors or like whoever did it, it's not okay. No ifs or buts, because it's not okay today. We know it happened, so therefore we're condemning it, we're canceling it, we're not talking about it. They don't exist anymore, erased from history. But and then it's as you said, like, but if they didn't do it, then you didn't have anything to be enraged about. So they gave you that purpose by doing that. They gave you something to be enraged about by doing this very same thing that you are now enraged about.
Yeah, and I think you have to acknowledge what your ancestors did and be grateful for it, but you don't have to agree, because we're allowed to evolve and we're allowed to change and you're allowed to do things better. You're allowed to have electricity. You don't have to live in a cave and do everything by moonlight just because your ancestors did. Because did the Druids worship out of doors? Well, some of the sources said they did, but then again, the Druids didn't have electricity, and if they wanted people to be able to see them during the ritual, it would make sense to do it outside in the sunlight where people could see them. Are there also stories of Druids performing rituals inside the Hall of the King? Yes. If it was raining and nasty out, would the Druids have done the ritual inside the Hall of the King? Probably. There's a very good rendering of, well, what if Stonehenge wasn't just a big open? What if it had a roof? And the roof, because it was made of grass and wood and things, it rotted away. But what if it had a roof? What if Stonehenge was actually an enclosed space that looked similar to like the Globe Theatre, you see? And these big pillars were the support pillars, the stone pillars. But
that's a good one.
There was actually a roof on it, like you have at the Globe Theatre, because other Celtic sites, these tombs and things, they're covered over with dirt, right? But there's stone inside holding up the dirt. But Stonehenge is old. Again, we don't have writing. They didn't have photography back then. We don't know. But it's possible that the Druids did worship indoors. So you don't have to go out in the woods if it's yucky out and do your ritual outside just because you think the ancient Druids would have done it that way, and therefore you have to too. You're allowed to evolve. We have electricity. You can do your ritual inside. You can still connect with your deity, with the divine, with nature, but you don't have to make yourself miserable in the process. I don't think if the ancient Druids had access to an indoor venue or electric lighting, that they wouldn't have used it.
No, I mean, it's, the comforts of modern times. I mean, we're in the end, we're all human, so nobody likes to be cold and wet, and like not even people from thousands of years ago. Like, why do you think we started building houses? Why do you think we started building huts and these great halls and all of that, so that we we literally had a roof over our heads. So, like, first of all, it's a lot safer for predators because they can't reach us as easily. We don't have to be cold and miserable when it's cold and miserable outside. So in the north of Europe, like, it's cold and miserable here for, I want to say, 9 months out of the year. You can, even those, those huge halls, you can, divide it up in smaller chambers, which are, a lot easier to heat up. So yeah, definitely. Like, I want to bet if the ancient druids, as you said, had access to a lot of things that we do, they would do the same thing. They are our ancestors. We are a product of them. So everything we do now, they probably did too, but in their way, and vice versa.
Yeah. And I feel like a lot of modern pagans, they're so obsessed with this idea of connecting to nature that they disconnect themselves from it in a strange kind of a way. You notice, if human beings are a part of nature, then we have a role to fulfill in that ecosystem, that we're meant to be the predator for certain other animals,
Mhm.
that we're meant to alter the landscape in the same way that beavers build a dam, humans build a dam. Wolves hunt deer, humans hunt wolves. It's a natural. And
Yeah.
I think you get neo-pagans who kind of fall more on that environmental pagan side of it. They become so obsessed with what they think is connection to nature that they think that human beings shouldn't interact with it in any meaningful way. They say, well, you shouldn't be allowed to hunt, you shouldn't be allowed to kill other animals because we're respecting nature. Okay, well, you
But
shouldn't be allowed to live in a house because that's not natural. You shouldn't be allowed to have profit. It's
no.
like, okay, well, but ants build ant hills and they farm other insects and keep them as farm. I mean, if ants are doing it, are ants nature? Where do you draw that line? If a monkey can pick up a stick and they have, if you've done any research on it, they have ape wars over in the jungle where two warring tribes of apes, they'll pick up sticks and they'll stab each other and have a war. But when
But
humans do it, it's unnatural suddenly for some reason. But if you believe that human beings are a part of nature and that they're meant to fulfill a role, they're meant to be part of the ecology of it, if you take human beings out of the equation, suddenly that disrupts the ecology of the nature. You look at places like North America for a more recent example, when the Native Americans, when the Europeans came over, a lot of them got sick from diseases they didn't have immunities to. A lot of them died off. And when the Europeans came, they thought, oh, look at this beautiful natural environment. They didn't realize that a lot of those forests were curated. Those were made that way by the Native Americans. The vast plains were made that way because the Native Americans burn off the grasslands every year so that they could make the fields for the buffalo. It wasn't
yeah.
just untouched nature. And so what happened when they got sick and a lot of them died off and suddenly there wasn't that native population, they weren't doing these things. Now all of a sudden, oh, the grassland is disappearing. But that was the natural way, and humans shouldn't interfere with nature. Well, now you don't have grasslands.
I
And
mean,
that
by
affects,
by living, you're interfering with nature. By breathing, you're interfering with nature. It's just, if you're interfering and interacting nature, there is no other way. If you have a physical body, you're interfering and interacting with nature. Like, it's just how it is. And yeah, a lot of pagans, a lot of neo-pagans are indeed too obsessed with nature, and but forgetting that, for a lot of us, for a lot of our ancestors, yeah, nature was important, but perhaps the home, the earth, even more so, because that was your safe space. That is where where you are together with the family. That is where the bond is the strongest. I mean, you had your altar indoors as well. You have to take both into consideration. It can't be, one or the other.
right?
It's difficult, of course, because I mean, it's the 21st century. It's not it's not the 10th century anymore. It's not the 11th century anymore.
Yeah.
Like, there is no like, we can try and emulate as best as we can how our ancestors lived or how they did it, but we'll never be able to carbon copy it,
Yeah.
because the world, and especially in 1,000 years, 1,500 years, I don't know how many, a lot. I mean, just think of, I don't know, like the beginning of 2020. That's 4 years now. How much has changed in those 4 years. Imagine 400 years. Imagine 4,000 years. There is
Oh,
no
I mean,
way. Sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
no. I mean, I just look at you look at artificial intelligence. I mean, 3, 4 years ago, oh, that was just some kind of a gimmick, right? That you saw in a science fiction movie. And
Yeah.
now it's integrated. It's on my phone. I can ask AI, paint me a picture, and it takes a little bit more effort than I think people realize, but you can still do it and get a picture, and you're carrying it around in your pocket, and
I mean, AI
that's kind
used
of
to be limited to like Siri or Google Assistant or whatever. And like, yeah, now we're at the point that it's like, is this an actual picture? Is this AI generated? Is this an actual, script that somebody wrote, or is this AI generated?
right.
And
And I think
that's just over the last like 2 years, maybe.
yeah, and I think it's interesting too because again, like I said, if human beings are a part of nature, then that means that everything we do is natural. That doesn't necessarily make it good or bad. It's still a natural thing to do these things, but not all of nature is going to be sunshine and rainbows and fuzzy bunnies. You've got
Oh God,
animals
I
that kill
wish.
each other. You've got cats that torture small critters. You've got ape wars. You've got those armies of ants that go through South America and just decimate 20, 30
Yeah.
mile swaths of the rainforest, almost like somebody dropped a nuke on it and it's just poof, gone.
Yeah.
So nature's not necessarily good or bad, but it is. And we have to figure out how best to interact with it in a way that makes things better and not
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing. Make it better, make it better for every being living on it, living in it, even though maybe that's impossible too, because what's good for the bunny may not be good for the cat. What's good for the cat may be bad for the ants. So,
yeah.
but we gotta create a good place for our furry friends, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, on balance, it's better to try and improve things. We're just mere human beings, we're not the divine. We don't necessarily know everything. Nobody can.
Even
You
though
just you do you
even
do the
though
best you
some people
can.
will tell you that they are and that they do and that they can, but we call them delusional.
Yeah, yeah. So I try to integrate, try to develop that connection with the divine in all things. And it's like, can I have that connection with the divine when I'm working on my computer? I could find a way to do that if I really wanted to.
Hmm.
Can I have that connection outside in the garden? And I think finding that balance, finding that connection in all aspects of your life is important. You can't just only connect with the divine in nature. You can't just only be a modern person when you're inside on your computer. You have to be able to integrate things together so that you can have balance. And I think that's important. That might not necessarily be a druid specific thing, but that's something that I try to strive for.
Yeah, no, which is a beautiful thing, of course. Balance. As long as as you are balanced, as long as you can find your inner balance, then it'll all be okay. You may be that small ripple, but it affects everyone else. It's something my second show today that I'm saying this, but it's something that my late grandmother always told me. If you want to improve the world, improve yourself. If you want to make a better world, start with making a better you, and everything will follow. So if you manage to balance yourself, eventually, hopefully, the rest will balance it out as well.
Yeah. And I find that's something that a lot of different religions and spiritualities have in common, the idea of bettering yourself before you worry about other people. Christianity has, take the log out of your own eye before you worry about other people. Buddhism has that whole you worry about yourself first and make sure, even when you're on an airplane, the flight attendant always tells you, put your mask on first before you help somebody else.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that's common across culture because how can you help somebody else if you're the one drowning?
For many people, is a hard lesson to learn. I know that I've definitely struggled with it. For some people, maybe also a form of escapism. If I just help others, then I won't have to think about my own problems. As long as I can, do something for someone else, I don't have to focus on, the things that I should be helping myself with. But eventually, it'll neck you. You can't keep that up forever. Like I said, that's definitely been a hard lesson for me, and that's why over the last few years I've been trying to to make my own situation better to make sure that I have, a stable, that I'm stable, like at least mentally somewhat stable enough. I mean, I don't think we're like mentally this will forever be fully stable. Stable mind, stable income, decent house, decent living environment. And yeah, I'm doing it for myself, but knowing that I'll help others with it as well, that knowing that I'll help my parents with it, that I'll help my siblings with it, knowing that that I help my kids with it. It's like, what use am I to them? What good am I to them? Or, wanting to help them if I can't even help myself? My parents are a few years off retirement age, and they need more help already with things. My sister, she's still young, but, has been through some, so, me as the big brother, it's my duty to step up. But like, how can I step up if I'm not even working on my own shit? Yeah, people, like, it's a hard lesson. It's a good escape to, not think about your own problems and just focus on everyone else, but it's not going to get you anywhere, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I try to work on my own spiritual development before I try to tell other people anything, and again, my personal belief, which may or may not be shared by other druids, is that the divine manifests itself in different forms at different times to different people for different purposes. How it manifests to me right now in this moment for this reason isn't going to be the same as it is for somebody else. It might be similar, but it's not going to be the same.
No.
And I need to work on being able to interpret and understand what it's telling me. I shouldn't be trying to tell somebody else what it's telling them, because I'm going to get it wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's where the whole dogma thing really falls apart. God said this to me, or the divine said this to me and told me this goes for everyone else as well. Doesn't matter your situation, doesn't matter how you live, where you live, these are the rules. This is how it goes. Make it work.
Right. And to be a druid citing the Bible, but I do because it has some good info in there. One of the things it says is that to love the Lord your God with all your heart and to love your neighbor, that's the whole of the law. Everything else derives from that. And you look at druid tradition, there's some in the Celtic stories, there's druid tradition where it says the 3 rules of a druid are to love the divine, to do no harm, and to be kind to others. Like, these kind of things are cross-cultural, they're cross-spiritual, these kind of lessons about the little nitty-gritty, the little nitpicky things are going to be different, but the main point of it is going to be however your divine manifests, recognize it and honor it for what it is, and to improve your connection to it and to try your best to be a good person according to what it's telling you. And the specifics of it aren't necessarily as important, I think. You look at the history of it, you have the Indo-Europeans, they all have a sky father. Right, for the most part. There's this hospitality that's kind of cross-cultural. People, you have to be kind to your guests because you never know, it could be a manifestation of the divine. That story is very popular among all kinds of pagan and Christian religions. In Christianity, you have, it could be an angel, or it could be Zeus, or it could be, you don't know. And so you have to treat people with respect. Kind of recognizing how we have more in common than we have different is more valuable, I think, than fighting. And some of there's differences. They're not necessarily trivial differences, and they are important. You catch more flies with honey, as the saying goes. If you live your life in such a way that you are a pleasure to be around, people like talking to you, they like getting to know you, they want to know, how are you the way you are? Why are you so great to be around? What are you doing in your life that makes you the way you are? How can I experience some of that? Can you tell me? What do you believe that makes you do things these ways? And then you can share with them and you can tell them. And that's far more effective than going around telling other people they're doing it wrong.
Character and personality is just so much more important than whatever it is you believe. I mean, it's well, I guess it goes both ways, because whether it be the 10 commandments or the 9 noble virtues or whatever, they're great. All of them are great, but it's common sense. Just have a bit of common sense, have some dignity, have some dignity for yourself. It's something we're quite lacking nowadays, some dignity and self-respect. Just be good. Just be a good person. Love thy neighbor. Always be kind to guests. You can mix and match however you like. It's just all comes down to just be good, and good will follow. This has been an amazing talk. This really went quite easy. An hour and a half just flew by. Is there anything else that you want to say? Anything else that you want to plug aside from your book, your newest adventure? Of course, you also have a merchandise line, don't you?
Yes, I do. So I have some t-shirts that I designed based on my blog and my website. So my website, The Druid's Den, is on WordPress. And it's also kind of the homepage for my own Druid Fellowship group. Like I said, there's so many different sects in it. There's all kinds of branches and things. And I decided, I want to do my own thing. So I did, as is common amongst Druids, to do your own thing. So I have the Druids of the Divine, that. And so that's available on my website as well, their homepage. And so I kind of designed some merch to go around with that. I picked the Celtic cross because, I feel like it's a very inclusive symbol. It has Celtic roots, pre-Christian and Christian. Green for kind of the natural elements, and then the golden circle for kind of that divine energy that surrounds all things, that connects us all, regardless of which branch we choose to follow. So we have some lovely t-shirts and sweatshirts and things that you can get on my merch store with this symbol on it if you like.
Yeah, I actually just got the email today that the piece that I bought is being shipped. So I'm curious to see when it'll be here and how it'll look. Because of course, I had to buy a piece of merchandise, especially if I'm having you on, then at least I should have something.
Well, you'll have to let me know how it looks, how the image translates. I haven't actually ordered any shirts for myself yet.
Well,
so I hope the logo. I hope when it made it bigger for the shirts, I hope it maintained it. It looks great on the website, but I haven't seen the physical.
Yeah, no, Bonfire is a good site to use for that. Their printing quality is pretty good. So yeah, I'll be the model. I'll be the guinea pig, and I'll definitely let you know. I'm excited.
So my little group, if people are interested in my particular version of Druidry, they're welcome to go on my website and read more about my group. And we do have a little non-denominational ritual that I've written that I like to use, and people can join us in person or in spirit. If you happen to be in Minnesota and you want to get to know us, you're more than welcome. And if you want to participate online, I have many people who participate online. One of the things that I do for my group is neo-pagans and druids, they kind of follow the wheel of the year. That's kind of the Wiccan derived. They have the 8 holidays that happen on specific dates. February 2nd is the spring holiday. Well, where I live in Minnesota, it's usually 40 below with 3 feet of snow on February 2nd. So it seems kind of silly for me personally, maybe not this year because it's been unusually warm, but most years it seems silly to celebrate spring in February with that kind of weather. So my group, we celebrate the change of the season when it happens. When the flowers first bloom, we celebrate that. When the leaves change color, we celebrate at that time, and that might be in September, it might be in October, so, and I feel like that's important because you're celebrating the change of the season, and that's going to be different depending upon your location. Just because in Britain in February it might be springtime with flowers, it's not going to be springtime with flowers in Minnesota in February. So I'm going to wait a month or two and celebrate it then when I see it, because it's important to be grateful for these things when they're happening.
And if you follow nature, it makes a lot more sense to do so.
Right. So that's kind of how I do with my group. But I announce on my website, on the blog, I announce, when we're having a thing. If people want to join, they can contact me through the website, and I'll send them the ritual, and they can participate, in spirit, follow along at home, or they can come and join us in Minnesota if they happen to be up here.
Awesome. Well, I've put most of the links up in the description down below. Of course, that being your website, your book, and at least also the merchandise store, because it is great merch. It really is. It looks awesome, and I'm excited for when it's gonna
Yep, and I am
gonna
still
arrive.
running my special. The first 3 people who
Hmm.
buy some merch also get a free PDF copy of my book, What is a Druid? So if you were thinking about getting either the shirt or the book and you can't quite decide, you can get both. All right, just get the shirt and then I'll send you the book, and then you'll have both.
Yeah, I have received my free copy. Haven't found the time to start reading it yet, but I definitely will shortly. Because I before I had you on just now, like I knew so little about Druidry. I mean, what I knew or what I know really is from the Asterix comic books. I don't know if you have those in the US, but it's from a Belgian artist, Asterix and Obelix. So that was my vision of what a druid is like. Just white robes, big white beards, or
Yep. Well, and
those weirdos dancing around at Stonehenge.
Yep. But if you get my book, I answer all those questions. Do druids have to have beards and white robes? Can they turn into animals like in Dungeons and Dragons? I answer all of those questions and more. So
one question is already answered because you don't have a beard and you're a druid. So
yeah.
But yeah, thank you very much for coming on. Thank you for sharing so much about druidry and your path and your art. It's amazing to hear, and I hope we'll get to see more of it, because you're quite the adventure that you're on. So yeah, definitely go check out Druid Foxx, her stuff. Everything is in the description box down below. Of course, thank you to everyone watching. Thank you to everyone who was in the comments. Thank you for everyone who will still watch or listen. You can find everything that we do on the Tribe of the Greyhorn Pagans on our website, www.greyhornpagans.com. On the site, I should also have a link to the Druid, her website, of course, because I always try to promote our members that are doing their own thing. So yeah, don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe. That bell you should be hitting. I think that's it. I've been a good influencer. I've been a good host. I did all the shilling that I'm supposed to do. Sorry, cat getting entangled. That's a good way to end the show. So yeah, until next time, Marjorie, Druid, thank you very much once again. It's really been awesome. And yeah, we'll keep in touch. Until next time.